Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, numbers have been very much in the news this summer, most often in reference to COVID-19. But in the past week, in assessing hurricane damage, we'll look at what we have learned from the numbers. Just as residents of Southwest Louisiana are assessing Hurricane Laura's damage, 15 years ago this week, the New Orleans region was doing the same. We will examine the Katrina rebuilding in terms of education and political reform, as well as the landscape. And we will take a special look at the performance of the police. All of this, plus the possibility of some fans being allowed to Saints games, are in the number for our Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Gordon Russell, managing editor for investigations, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV, Channel 4. And Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. We'll go over to Gordon first. And how do we look this week in the pandemic? What are our numbers there?
Well, the recent news has been mostly pretty good. You know, we've had a second wave that we've talked about on the show that was not quite as bad, certainly not as deadly as the first wave. And that second wave, which kind of went all across the state of Louisiana, that one has clearly waned, and we're in kind of a valley or a trough, you might say. I guess the recent slightly worrisome news is that there's some evidence that with people going back to colleges and to school, everyone's watching this very closely to see what's going to happen with that, because that's really the biggest new thing that has changed. We're still in phase 2 restrictions otherwise. So the biggest change we've seen in the last couple of months is this return to campus, which is happening, of course, in all different kinds of forms. But for instance, there's some evidence that Orleans Parish has had an uptick in the last couple of weeks, and there's some pretty strong evidence. In fact, we're going to be publishing a story today about this. Jeff Asher did an analysis, and it seems that a lot of the increase in Orleans Parish is really centered around Tulane University. And so it's not surprising that you've got all these kids coming back from all over the country. The university is doing aggressive testing, and it's not surprising that you're going to find cases. I guess the question is, and they're taking there's a lot of measures they're taking to stop the spread. The question is whether that's all going to work. And of course, it's very difficult to keep college kids or any kids from socializing and that sort of thing. So I think, the next few weeks are going to be they're going to be worth watching. I mean, they all are, but we're in a moment now where you could see things get worse, or you could see if things stabilize kind of where they are, that would be encouraging.
And Gordon,
but I think, sorry, go ahead.
To top it all, the evacuation from South Louisiana because of Hurricane Laura, all the people, and that was one of the highest areas in terms of the numbers. Yeah. And now these people are spreading throughout the state, including New Orleans.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much that's going to affect things, and it certainly could. And one thing you don't like to have is a lot of new populations mixing together at a time during a pandemic. And as you said, that was one of the areas that was more of a hotspot at the time that struck. And we've got at least 6,000 people from Southwest Louisiana in New Orleans. So that is an additional concern. And I think it's going to take us a while to unpack all of that and figure out whether they did the evacuation correctly and whether officials putting people on buses and that sort of thing were able to do it in a way that didn't encourage the spread of this disease.
When we saw the uptick, the second wave, one of the reasons cited was because of large gatherings and no social distancing not being used and people not wearing masks, et cetera. So is that sort of what we're seeing with college kids doing these large gatherings?
I think that there has to be some of that going on, and I've seen some evidence of it down. I mean, I like to take my dog swimming in the river, and I've seen kids partying down there some. And I mean, the university, I think, has been very clear about you shouldn't, you're not allowed to do this. We'll send you home, or, you'll be in deep trouble if you do this. But I think it's hard to prevent that. Yeah. And of course, we have a Labor Day weekend starting now, and that's another concern, is that tends to be a lot of family gatherings and that sort of thing during holiday weekends. So those are all things that could affect it.
So, I mean, the movement from phase two, I mean, we're in phase two until, what, mid-September or so, or close to mid-September. The thought of even getting out of that, once again, as Errol wrote in the lead, and it all depends on the numbers, and we just have to closely watch the numbers.
Yeah, and I assume that all the people who are making these decisions from the governor on down are going to be wanting to feel like they've assessed the impact of reopening schools before they make that decision.
Right.
In other words, why would you want to make a decision on that until you've figured out whether this has caused a big new uptick? Because we could be in a position in a few weeks where, they're going back to virtual school.
Yeah, we just have to wait and see. And certainly it's going to, Dawn, did you want to make a quick statement, a comment?
It's very hard, I think, for all these folks to regulate 18-year-olds who are coming together very, very quickly, who haven't been with anybody for so long, and then to possibly send them back virtual. It just said, please no. Let's hope we can all behave well enough to stay together.
Yeah, nothing about this whole thing has been easy, and certainly, back to the numbers, that's going to impact whether or not fans will be in the Superdome to watch some Saints games.
Yeah, well, the good news is that this week that the Saints announced that they've talked to the state, and the state's agreed with the idea of allowing fans into the second game. The first game, which is the big game, the one against the Buccaneers, no one will be allowed. But the second game, which is also big because it's against the Packers, they're going to. It seems like they're going to allow 25%, and they have a very, very complex formula how they're going to do that. For example, they're very sensitive. If you got two people who always go to a Saints game and they have season tickets, it's okay. But what if they go with 6 other people and they tailgate, and they don't want to break up those groups? And so where there's awareness of a group thing, they're trying to be sensitive, and they're going to rotate them. And so it's a very complex thing, but at least the good news, and then they put up a rotation over the rest of the games among the season ticket holders. Now, some season ticket holders have had the option to just opt out of the whole thing for this year, but the ones that are still there. So that was the good news. The bad news, or maybe the concerning news, is that the mayor says, well, not so fast. She thought that the rules looked okay. She says, these are good rules, but we don't know if we're there yet. And her big concern is money, that they need a lot of money from the state. The federal government, through that CARES program, is sending a lot of money. And the city had requested $98 million, and they got $53 million. And, of course, they have their huge debt, too. And so she's saying, we need security, we're going to need first responders, we need fire, and to do all this. And so we need to work this out. The other thing, I wonder if Gordon Lee thinks, I wonder if this is a first sign of what's to come, because there's going to be other big decisions like this coming up soon. There's going to be the Jazz Fest and Carnival and those kind of things, where up to this point we've been looking at the numbers, but then it's going to be another factors. Okay, I got the numbers, but how about the money for us to be able to support these?
Yeah, no, it's a real thing. I think you're right that it is going to be very complicated, and there's a lot of people who have to sign off on these things, which could make it more difficult for things to get green-lighted, obviously.
So if there are people in the Dome, Errol, how many people would be allowed at one time? What does that come to? What numbers are there? Well,
it'd be 25%. With the Dome's seats about 80, so would that be about around 20,000 people? Yeah, around 20. They will have sound, though. They have piped-in sound that the NFL is allowing to have piped-in noise reaction. And Mark Roaming, who does the touchdowns, he'll be there, and he'll be announcing those things, too. And so all the accoutrements of the game will be there except for the fans. And it's really kind of heartbreaking because New Orleans just supports this team so well. It's one thing, if it was a franchise we didn't support, but, man, you really could have packed them to see that first game.
Absolutely. Well, we'll be looking for that first game on television, though, at least.
Next
we will
week.
be able to. Yep. Okay. Thanks a lot, E. Dawn, over to you. Let's now sort of look back at Katrina and what it brought us. A lot of destruction and a lot of sorrow, that's for sure, but also some change. And largely, one of the big areas was in education.
And it really is a Katrina silver lining, Marcia. By all measures, before Hurricane Katrina, Orleans Parish school system was a failing system where the numbers show 6 in 10 children were attending a failing school. 15 years later, that number's down to less than 1 in 10. And New Orleans really, I talked to Leslie Jacobs, who was on the Bessie board and a leader in education reform in the city, as well as a professor named Douglas Harris from Tulane University, who has just released a book titled Charter School City, And both say you don't usually get a situation where you can completely stop a system and get a chance to restart it. You usually are moving and changing as you're going, not all schools closed, wait, we can recreate them and open back up. So it's a once in a lifetime kind of unthinkable experiment. But then we reopened as this experimental charter school city. And by all measures, 15 years later, it really has been a good thing. Our high school graduation rates in Orleans Parish have gone from 54% in 2005 to 73% in 2015, which is the last year they have statistics for this book. College entry rate from 37% to 63%. Then if you look at where we rank parish by parish or school system by school system, there are 68 school systems in the state. Prior to Hurricane Katrina, we ranked 62nd out of 68 on ACT scores. That rank has now moved all the way up to 42nd, so moved up 20 points. You usually only move a few points at a time, not that many. Test scores moved up from 67th out of 68 in the state to 40th out of 68 in the state. So it really has been a model that has proven to work. It's not without controversy, but what Leslie Jacobs told me is it's also helped in this pandemic time because you have more local control. So you have schools that have been able to be more nimble and act more quickly. Orleans Parish schools did a better job than some surrounding parishes at getting computers and hotspots and meals to children faster when the pandemic hit than some of the other systems. But that's also meant for challenges. Like, when do we go back to school? Who's the decision maker? So some things are circling back now that we're in the pandemic so that there will be a unified calendar, a blueprint for reopening. So instead of just all that local control, we're seeing some necessary changes now with the pandemic. But by all measures, we've got, go ahead.
No, I was saying, I remember before Katrina, people were talking about charters. That had become like a national issue. But when that issue had come to the school board, and I think it came fairly soon before Katrina, it was always no. It was always straight down, a lot of pressure from the unions and from different lobbying forces. And so it never got close. And then after Katrina, said, well, maybe so. Okay. And they allowed
Exactly.
That opened the door.
Gave it the opportunity to come in. And now what you're seeing also, not just college entry rates, but a lot more kids, 20% of Orleans Parish students in technical programs where they're graduating and going into jobs with high incomes and lots of upward mobility that didn't exist before Katrina either. So lots of positive change there.
And what about graduation? I know the state has seen an improvement in graduation rates. Did Orleans Parish also see it in cohort graduation? Yeah.
They went from 54% of kids graduating to 73% of kids graduating. And one other big change, there's been a whole push to get police officers out of schools and have more restorative justice and not just suspending and expelling kids. And that expulsion rate in Orleans Parish is now well below the state average. And we really set the bar for the state prior to Katrina. So some systems changing all across the board. The big thing now that is needed is more focus on the 0 to 4 years old education.
At one point,
Alrighty.
At one point, wasn't New Orleans like the national model for the charter school systems?
We still are.
Yeah.
We are the national model, and there's research being done. This book that I told you about that just came out, but there are researchers all across the country and in fact the world who look to Orleans Parish as a way to kind of study education.
Because Orleans is now 100% charter. Is that correct? Okay. All righty, Dawn.
It's not no. There are a couple schools still within.
Still within.
Control,
I thought it was all charter. Okay. All righty. Thanks a lot, Dawn. Mike, over to you. Back on what Katrina brought us. Let's take a look at the police department, NOPD.
All right, and of course, going back to Katrina right after the 15th anniversary, can't help but have our thoughts with everyone affected by Laura, because as we know, the real hard work isn't the immediate shock of the storm itself, but after the national news goes away and even some of the local media is on to other stories, the real hard work begins. And we know all too well in New Orleans how that goes. The police department, we had an opportunity to really look back and go in depth about the police department 15 years later after Katrina, when Eddie Compass, in a manner of speaking, broke his silence, at least some of the most in-depth accounts directly from him in a 2-part show on WBOK with Oliver Thomas. We were able to sit in on that, and I was able to talk to him each day, afterward to put some stories on television. And it just reminded me, as part of the New Orleans Times-Picayune, Gordon Russell was part of what we called the New Orleans Bureau of the Times-Picayune. And one of my colleagues, Brian Teveno, put it in a way that really stuck with me, that we were operating in what he called the fog of warlike conditions. And it really was a fog as far as communications. We know that the police department was operating without, the kind of radio contact. So there was no command and control structure. The officers, many times we found them just sort of wandering and driving through the city without a mission and without orders, and not even knowing where their commanders were, much less having a mission plan. And that just permeated everything that the NOPD did. And we know that there were some horrific events, the Danziger Bridge. There was, it turned out to be a false report of someone with a gun ambushing police. Next thing you know, NOPD comes rushing to the scene and, blazes away at innocent civilians. The Henry Glover case on the West Bank, in which another person just trying to, get out of the floodwaters, shot and killed by police officers in one location, driven to a police compound at an elementary school, and then left dying, taken in the car behind a levee, and the car was lit on fire. And that didn't get solved for years, and that was thanks to efforts by the media. So there was a lot that did go wrong. Now, Eddie Compass was one of those casualties. As we know full well, just short of 4 weeks into this disaster, he got fired. And, it was a mixed report card for Eddie Compass. He was always a highly emotional leader, a real hands-on, slap on the back kind of police chief. And that high emotion, it turned out to be part of his downfall. He broke down a couple times. He cried on TV. The Oprah interview in particular was widely seen. But I think even more important than that was the false information. He had heard, basically raw information from officers, that babies were being raped in the Superdome. He repeated that. But when you say that on Oprah, that becomes, a national headline instantly. Turned out that was not the case. And I know that our team, Gordon Russell included, we caught on very quickly that some of the things being reported, even out of the mouths of the highest level officials all the way up to the governor, turned out not to be true. So we adopted a rule that we were only going to put out there and publish, initially online and later in a print edition, things that we would see with our own eyes. And just to give you an example of one very persistent rumor that we chased, was that there was bodies stacked in a freezer near the convention center, and that they were under the watch of the National Guard. That sounded like, tragic if true, but something that absolutely needed to be verified. So we set out and we talked to one commander and went to the next higher ranking commander, and eventually turned out there was no body. I mean, there was no freezer, full of dead bodies. And we were able to debunk that and really change the national narrative about what was going on. Yes, there was some lawlessness, there was mass looting, those were shocking images, and people were shot and killed, but as it turns out, mostly by police.
So, let's jump forward to today now, and the police force that we have today, stronger, better? Could we count on it more than what happened during Katrina?
Well, there were some, very important lessons learned, and there were some obviously technological advances that would help tremendously if we were ever in a similar situation. Starting with the communications, term of art is hardening of the communication system so that it would not go down and leave officers just wherever they were when the floodwaters hit, just scrambling, not knowing what to do. Officers would be deployed differently. I remember the whole 3rd District had thought they were in a safe spot at the LSU dental school over by City Park. Of course, that was surrounded by floodwater, and they were basically marooned and had to be rescued themselves. So deployment plans better. Now, one thing that is quite interesting that might not be in the NOPD's favor is it's a much younger department, including a lot of people from out of town. We had a lot of homegrown veteran officers then who knew the streets, were very savvy, got in boats, even with everything underwater, knew where they were going. I'll just give one quick example.
And it has to be quick, Mike. We got to wrap this up.
Real quick. A lot of alarm about, hearing gunshots from the, buildings, and helicopters, stopped for a whole day from rescuing people. But an officer very wisely realized that some of those gunshots were people signaling that they were there and needed to be rescued. Mm-hmm. And that officer kind of turned the tide, helped rescue people who were using a gun to signal that people were alive and needed to be helped. So that's maybe a little difference with our current police force.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mike. Go over to Errol. Some other changes, too, that you wanted to talk about that Katrina brought.
Well, a lot of changes in different ways. I make the analogy like New Orleans after Katrina was like an old house, which we have many of, and they have a crack in the ceiling, which there are many of in old houses, and someone saying, we're going to fix that one day. We'll get around to it. Well, Katrina made that one day come. Like, this was a time to straighten up, to fix everything. Let's get everything better. And throughout the city, there were all kinds of things that went on, even governmentally. For some reason that Katrina gave us an incentive is, let's fix up some things about the structure of government. For example, before Katrina, we had a system where there were 7 assessors. I mean, we were like the only parish in the state that had everybody just says like 1 assessor. And that was changed to having 1. We used to have 2 sheriffs, a criminal sheriff and a civil sheriff, made it down to one sheriff. And with each sheriff, there was a corresponding clerk, a civil clerk and a criminal clerk. And so there's a lot of that kind of tidying up of government that went on. And then what went on with the school board, which Dawn referred to, was just really just amazing. So that happened. But also around the state, I mean, people started rebuilding their houses. A lot of them were getting their insurance checks, so they had money. And so money was being spent, and so a lot of houses were rebuilt. Some of them, if you go to the lakeside, I mean, just from the ground and rebuilt real high. You drive around Lakeview, and they got those flood regulations and so the buildings start like almost on the 2nd floor. And so there was almost a rebuilding. But I think a real example of what happened was with City Park. I mean, City Park before Katrina had these ambitions of being like, let's be one of the great parks in the United States. And they'd even done this big master plan. Katrina just devastated it. I remember just driving through it. It was just all gray. It was like 2,000 trees were knocked down. Every building that was there was either knocked down or damaged. Everything was ruined. And they figured it would take about $100 million to fix it up. But with their insurance and with FEMA, they even allowed FEMA to park its trailers in City Park, which I thought was a pretty smart move. But with help from FEMA, with help from the ASBE Foundation, which is a New Orleans-based foundation, the ASBE Foundation allowed money to open up the botanical gardens, and the botanical gardens were used to have a huge fundraiser as a prelude to celebration in the Oaks. The Trust for Public Land, it's this national organization, came up with $2 million to develop one of the great things in City Park, one of the great amenities, and that is the walkway around, if you go to Delgado, the area they call Big Lake, in the area that walks there, around there. It's a beautiful place.
Really beautiful. That was just absolutely a major change and beautiful improvements. So we have to wrap this one up, but you're right, everything you talked about, absolutely.
So it did touch off a lot of changes for the better.
Right. All right, E, thanks a lot. And so we're going to flip back to modern day, contemporary hurricane, Lake Charles and Lake Charles, Louisiana. Gordon, how's the community doing?
I mean, I think it's really devastated, and I feel terribly for the people who live there, because I think that in some ways it's already a forgotten story for a lot of the country. I mean, I think Louisiana is aware of it, but Lake Charles is kind of an unloved place in America, or just an unknown place in America. And I think that the national media narrative on this is, oh, Lake Charles is going to be underwater with 20 feet of water in the streets, and then that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And then people said, oh, they dodged a bullet, which is a little bit what happened here with Katrina until we were drowned eventually. But, there was an initial thought that New Orleans had dodged a bullet. Well, I think people feel like Lake Charles dodged a bullet, but in fact, the damage is devastating. And they've got, not a lot of people died there, blessedly, because they didn't have the high waters, but the wind damage was tremendous, and they've got, more than 100,000 people who don't have reliable drinking water to flush their toilets, and they've got more than that are still out of power. So I think they've got a really long slog ahead, and it could be a Katrina-like event for them where they you may have people relocating out of the area because it's going to take them so long to get back to their homes and so forth. I mean, it could be something that really changes that place forever.
Is that extensive damage, is that pervasive? Does that cover the whole area of Lake Charles, or is it sort of isolated to a certain area?
It's pretty, yeah, I mean, it's a wide swath. It really covers pretty much all of Lake Charles. I mean, not every house is knocked down, but that level of damage is persistent across Lake Charles. It's about a 40 or 50 mile wide swath of that part of Louisiana, and it goes up past Lake Charles too. Yeah. I mean, there's damage all the way up, into North Louisiana. Of course, not as serious, but it was still a Category 2 hurricane, I think, when it passed Alexandria. So I mean, it was the strongest storm in terms of wind that we've ever had in Louisiana.
And to have the power out and water out, that's just devastating. They just can't get their city up until that's returned. So,
right, and trying to make a go of it in 100-degree heat while you're trying to fix these things.
We remember that.
I mean,
yeah,
we do.
We definitely have memories of it. All right, Gordon, thanks a lot. All right, guys, we're going to have to wrap it up now. So, to our round table and other stories. I'm going to start with you. Sorry, who was that? Mike, I'm sorry.
Well, I think we're about to begin an era in a big way where there's going to be a lot of outdoor dining. I mean, we know the city's been encouraging that, and just today they've announced that they're going to loosen the regulations in terms of parking in front of restaurants to encourage more restaurant dining. And you're seeing these tents and these shelters going up. And so I think within the next month or so, this is going to be a scene of a lot of people dining outside.
All right, Don?
We'll talk about schools again. After Labor Day happens, St. Tammany and Orleans Parish students will be back in school. And the LHSAA has announced a start date for high school sports, and it's October 8th through 10th that weekend.
All right, Mike.
And another story that I've been following closely for WWL-TV is a series I've called Highway Robbery on Staged Accidents, in which now we've had a second indictment with 11 new defendants, and we understand that case is very active and that the next action we see could be an indictment that names attorneys, local accident attorneys, as defendants.
We'll be looking for that. Thanks, Mike. All right, Gordon.
I just wanted to recommend a story we published online today that'll be in the paper over the weekend about plantations in Louisiana and how they're changing their marketing to more accurately reflect what they represent, to talk about the experience of slaves and so forth, instead of just focusing on the enslavers who own these places. And I think it's a really interesting piece and obviously a distinctive part of Louisiana's tourism culture.
All righty, so that's coming up this weekend. Well, it's online already, I think, huh? And then in the
already, yeah.
Okay. All righty, guys. Thanks a lot for joining us from your various spots. Thank you all for joining us too. Have a wonderful, safe, happy Labor Day. See you next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.